again for joining us today.
Thank you, Linda. And thanks everybody for joining today. Is the photo of Yellowstone Lake still appearing on the screen? I think it probably is. Let me know if it's not. One of the nicer days on Yellowstone Lake, they're coming to an end. I thought I'd start off the presentation just with a few comments about last year's flood. And here are some aerial images of the Lamar Valley, both during the flood event, which was in, as you know, probably early mid-June last year, and then afterwards, and the way the flood, rearranged a lot of the, what we for many years knew the Lamar to be, and not only the Lamar, but Slough Creek and other streams, Soda Butte as well. Not that it didn't damage or anything, but it sure changed things. And if you had favorite fishing spots in some of these streams, which a lot of people do, you might, you go back there and notice that they're either gone or they're just look completely different than they did before. I was able to get up into upper Slough Creek on Labor Day weekend last year. And this is above the North Park boundary. In this photo, I just snapped because in the distance here, if you look at my cursor, there's a bunch of rock, gravel material piled up here. And when you actually, if I zoom in on that, the tree behind here, you can see the amount of material just dumped in this one spot during the flood. And this was common all up and down upper Slough Creek for sure. It just really changed things. And it's going to be interesting to watch how over time, this kind of settles back into some kind of normal, if there is such a thing. But the fishing, I think the densities of fish, most people that were angling last year in the northern part of the park, I think probably would say the densities were down after the flood compared to the years previous, but the condition of the cutthroat was really amazing. They were very healthy fish, chunky, and although maybe not as many as you typically see in a lot of those pools, they were just in amazing condition, probably because of the lower densities and less competition among them. So they're really doing well, and they'll bounce back fairly quickly, I would assume. In many of these places, these cutthroat evolved with flood as a part of their life history. They're used to it. So today I'd like to touch base on our major parts of what we do in the park for native fish conservation. That being our work on Yellowstone Lake to restore the Yellowstone Lake ecosystem, with the major effort being suppression of non-native lake trout there. Then we'll shift gears and talk a bit about our cutthroat trout and Arctic grayling work outside of the Yellowstone Lake ecosystem, and just a few of the projects I'll highlight there. And we'll end with a couple comments about angling and AIS prevention, our regulations for angling, and that kind of stuff will be at the very end. So, okay, well, Yellowstone Lake, I'll provide some background information here for anyone that is maybe not familiar. We've been working on Yellowstone Lake since 1995, essentially to suppress invasive lake trout, which got into the lake somehow. We're not exactly sure how, but they've been really a challenge, and they've been very harmful to our native cutthroat trout of Yellowstone Lake. So these cutthroat trout of Yellowstone Lake were the sole trout of Yellowstone Lake. They evolved there over thousands of years without any other large fish in the lake. There was one small minnow species that was native, but for sure there were no within lake predators on these cutthroat trout. So they're fairly naive to being preyed upon by other fish within the lake. The other fish within the lake that we're dealing with here, the lake trout, were intentionally brought in by managers in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And this was just because when the park was first established, about half the waters in Yellowstone naturally did not harbor fish because of waterfalls and so on that prevented their colonization after the last glaciation. So managers look to stock fish in many of these places to improve fishing, for food and all that kind of stuff for park visitors and people that live in the park. And they do very, very good at moving fish around in these milk cans and other things and stocking them all across the park. And a lot of the fish they stocked came from outside the park, and that's the problems that we're really dealing with now. So non-native lake trout were stocked intentionally up in Lewis and Shoshone lakes. These are in the upper Snake River, and they were stocked in 1890, and they came from Lake Michigan, where lake trout are now. They're working to restore Lake Michigan lake trout, and they actually take lake trout from this lake now in Yellowstone, and they use the gametes and the fish from Lewis Lake to reintroduce back into the Great Lakes, which is just a whole nother interesting story, but it's part of what goes on here. The lake trout are found in 1994 in Yellowstone Lake over the Continental Divide from the Snake River. We're not sure how they got here. It doesn't really matter because they're incredibly harmful to our native cutthroat trout in the lake. And so that's why we're working hard to suppress the population. They're highly predatory on our native cutthroat trout. They only live basically within the lake. They don't use spawning streams or anything like that, like the cutthroat trout do. So they spawn within the lake itself, and so they live deep in the lake, and then that makes them inaccessible to native predators in the lake ecosystem that can't get to them. And they produce thousands of eggs. Each female can produce 10,000 eggs or more, depending on the size of the fish, of course. So they're very good at what they do. And here's a photo of a fish I opened up a couple years ago, right at ice off. And one hypothesis we've had is that under the ice, there's no spatial separation, or there's no thermal reason for there to be separation among the lake trout and the cutthroat trout when the temperature of the water from under the ice to the bottom of the lake is consistent. There's the lake trout have free running throughout the entire water column of the lake, and the one thought is that during that time they can be extremely harmful and prey upon our cutthroat. And sure enough, at least in this one case, this fish had 12 cutthroat trout in its stomach when we gill netted it right after the ice melted off the lake. And we've seen a lot of other fish like this as well. There's a lot that goes on in Yellowstone Lake between October and May when we don't have access to it because of the winter and everything. And I think the lake trout, since we're not netting them then, especially, they're really doing a lot of harm to our ecosystem and these cutthroat under the ice, unfortunately. So they've had a major impact on our native cutthroat trout. This graphic shows just after the discovery of lake trout in the early 1990s. The red line here is the abundance or biomass of lake trout and how that increased from the 1997 through the late 2000s. And concurrently then in the blue line is the number of spawning cutthroat trout in a primary spawning stream. And of course, the decline we saw in most of our front country spawning streams, we saw upwards of a 90% decline in cutthroat during that period or more. And of course, then we also saw the impacts on the wildlife that are dependent upon the cutthroat in the Yellowstone Lake ecosystem. They were lost or displaced from the ecosystem due to the cutthroat trout decline. So we work aggressively to suppress the gill netting, or suppress the lake trout by gill netting. We have a large gill netting fleet that I just learned about recently. We're actually adding another boat like this that it's on its way right now. So we'll have about 6 of these large gill netting boats going this year on the lake. These are specialized gill netting tugs. And this video just kind of gives you a sense of what goes on these boats. They're staffed by crews that work from very early in the morning till late in the day, every day, 6 days a week, from when the ice comes off, usually the end of May, through the middle of October when the winter chases us off the lake. The gill nets are lifted from the lake using these hydraulic rotary drums. It's a gill net lifter there. The fish are then brought in the nets and sorted and removed from the nets by the crews. So the nets are then, once the fish are out of the nets, we some of them, if they're we'll actually put tags in and track these fish. So we'll put acoustic tags in several of these fish each year. Usually upwards of 200 of these lake trout are tagged, then released alive back into the lake, where then we have receivers and we track them throughout the lake throughout the year, and especially in the fall, and they lead us essentially to other aggregations of lake trout that we can then target. The dead lake trout are put back deep into the lake so we don't recapture them in our nets, because that's a horrible situation when you actually pull in a lake trout that has been killed before and then rotted in the net, and you bring it in and it's a bad day on the boat after that happens. And so, but here, this video shows the decomposing carcasses, and this would probably be 250 to 300 feet down Yellowstone Lake. And we're doing a lot of research to help us understand essentially the fate of the carcasses in the lake ecosystem going forward. This map depicts the distribution of nets across the lake. Each of the different colors are the different nets set by the different boats, and we basically are netting in water out to about 180 feet deep throughout most of Yellowstone Lake. We set last year we set over 5,500 miles of gill net were set and then retrieved through the lake through the season, which is enough net to stretch from one end of the lower 48 US and then back again to the other. So you could cross the country here twice with that net. It's pretty crazy. Our lake, what have we done to the lake trout population? So here we are from the 1990s all the way through this past year, 2022. There are three lines on this graph. The black line is the estimated abundance of the age 2 lake trout in Yellowstone Lake each year through time. And you can see that in the age 3 to 5 fish, which is the gray line, and then the adult fish, age 6 plus, is the dashed line. And they all increased all the way up until about 2012, when we finally got enough effort put out in the lake in terms of netting to drive the population, at least the adult segment of the population, into a steep decline. So the dash line is the adult fish. The adult on the y-axis is here on the right side. So we drove the adult segment of the population down from about 54,000 fish in 2012 all the way down to about only 4,000 fish are estimated to remain in the lake now in 2022. It's a 92% decline in the adult segment of the population, which are the predatory fish on our cutthroat trout, and they are also the ones that are producing the young lake trout and sustaining the population. And that's why we work so hard to drive that segment of the lake trout down, I'm not going to say extinction, but we've driven it down by 92%, and that's pretty good. And we're going to continue to do that. The issue that we still have, though, is even those fish that remain, those adults that are out there, are still continuing to produce young and recruit age 2 fish to the population. And so we do enough gill netting that these age 2 fish here, or these age 3 to 5 fish here, they don't survive to become adults. We kill them before they turn into be 5 or 6 years old. But it just means we have to keep up the netting effort, so we make sure we do that. So our age 2 fish, in terms of the number of lake trout in the lake, like the ones that are actually out there in the most abundance, are the ones that sort of dominate the catch and dominate the population now. We've been developing ways to reduce that age 2 recruitment by treating spawning areas by the lake trout in the fall and killing their embryos on the spawning sites so they can't produce young from these sites. And we've been very good at doing that as well, and we're going to continue to do that kind of work into the future. So what have we done regarding the cutthroat trout in Yellowstone Lake ecosystem? All this effort to suppress lake trout, has it been paying off? And We have standardized netting in Yellowstone Lake. So consistently every year, we're doing the same thing during the same weeks of the summer across these sites we've selected, nearly 15 years ago or more. And we do the same work every year. So we have consistent information we can track from one year to the next to the next. And so we have these data that we can use to track sort of what the cutthroat trout population is doing in Yellowstone Lake. So this graphic, we've been doing this standardized gill netting all the way back into the late 1970s. So this graph starts about 1980, prior to the lake trout invasion of the lake, and it extends all the way through 2022. Each of these points is the average number of cutthroat trout caught in 100 meters of net set over a single night. So that's our unit of effort for the cutthroat trout. And we set these nets at 24 sites around the lake, all around the lake, and we set them at different depths. But the depths we use for cutthroat trout are the shallow sets of these nets. That's what catches the cutthroat, and that's what we use to assess the population. So prior to the lake trout invasion, lake trout probably got in the lake sometime in the 1900s, for sure in the 1980s, and we first discovered them in 1994. The average number of cutthroat trout caught by this assessment program was about 40 fish per net of all different sizes. Then after the lake trout invaded the lake and started expanding throughout the lake, you can see the dramatic decline in our netting assessment catch of the cutthroat trout to really low. And so by the time you get to 2009 and 2010, this is really like the bottom of the barrel for the cutthroat population in Yellowstone Lake. But when we began our intensive gill netting, when we really doubled down on our effort and brought more boats and more crews out there by 2012, then the cutthroat trout and the lake trout then went into decline. The cutthroat trout have responded positively, and our average now is just shy of 40, but it's above what we call our secondary desired condition, or secondary benchmark. So basically, our recovery goals for cutthroat trout are 40 fish per net. That would be a perfect situation and would put us back to what we were prior to the lake trout invasion. But we have a secondary goal of 26 per net, which is the average number of cutthroat trout that were in Yellowstone Lake during the early stages of the lake trout invasion. And so, because we know we cannot get rid of all the lake trout in Yellowstone Lake, it's reasonable to say that having this as a secondary goal is good. I mean, because the lake trout are always going to be out there. But as you can see, we're surpassing that, and we're approaching this primary goal, and we're really excited about this. The other thing to keep in mind is that, we're not comparing apples and apples here, so to speak. These are actually apples and oranges or whatever. What I'm trying to say is that the fish that are in Yellowstone Lake now are longer and much heavier than the fish prior to the lake trout invasion. So if you caught, for example, if you did catch an 18 or 20-inch cutthroat prior to the lake trout invasion in the 1980s or early 90s, and they would be hard to catch because there weren't many of them out there. And you catch one now, if you catch a 20-inch cutthroat now, it weighs on average twice as much as that same length fish would have weighed prior to the lake trout invasion. So even though we're also getting increased numbers of fish in the lake, you have to keep in mind that these fish are much larger, much heavier, and so the biomass here overall may actually be the same or surpass what we had prior to the lake trout invasion. We're working on trying to understand that, but it's just something to keep in mind, and especially from the perspective of an angler, these fish are phenomenal. It's really awesome out there for sure. One thing we've never been able to answer, I mean, this is probably one of the most asked questions going back a long, long time, is how many cutthroat are there in Yellowstone Lake? And there's really never been a lake-wide estimate created, going back historically and everything like that. So we're taking this on. We're actually putting quite a bit of time into studying our cutthroat trout now after many, many years of really focusing our research on lake trout. We have a really good program trying to understand all aspects of the cutthroat population right now, and that includes being able to answer how many cutthroat trout are in the lake. So we're tagging cutthroat trout and we're releasing them back into Yellowstone Lake, and then recapturing them later. And anglers are a part of this. We started tagging fish last year. These are fish that we're catching in really large live entrapment nets, so they're not gill netted or anything like that. So they stay healthy in these live trap nets. We tag them, we release them to the lake, and then we're recapturing them either by angling or by our gill netting boats are recapturing some of them and that kind of thing. So at least for you all, if you're out there or on the rivers and streams around the lake, if you see a fish that has these yellowish tags, this is what they look like close up. Each of the fish has its own unique number, and that number is what we really, really, really need to get back from you all if you catch one of these fish. This is my work cell phone number here, so you can call or text. And if you text, you can include a picture of the fish, which I love getting. And then, but the main thing that we need to get back is the actual number that's on that tag. If I get a picture of the fish and know that you caught a tag fish, that's great. But without the number, it actually doesn't really do us a whole lot of good in terms of our study to try and estimate the population size. So please include that number. Many fish were caught by anglers last summer. And actually, what was really cool is that even though we were tagging them within the lake, a lot of the tag returns were actually coming from the Yellowstone River downstream of the lake when it came into fall, like September and early October. I was surprised how many fish actually moved into the river late in the year like that, and then were caught by anglers. So our suppression program, to summarize, it really is resulting in the return of cutthroat trout to Yellowstone Lake and some of the spawning streams. And we've killed more than 4.3 million lake trout since 1995 now. And after this year, it's going to be over 4.5 million probably. So the adult lake trout have been reduced by over 90%, but we're still getting these pulses of age 2 fish that recruit back to the lake that we need to continue to gill net out of there. The cutthroat abundance should decline or should continue to increase as the lake trout further decline. But unfortunately, we can't get rid of all the lake trout in the lake, and so we have to continue this kind of suppression. We believe the system will transition to a state that has low lake trout numbers and sustainable population of healthy cutthroat trout. And once we reach this state, we can hopefully reduce our suppression netting and to maintain the low lake trout numbers within the lake. That's our plan. Okay, I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about our streams work for Yellowstone cutthroat trout, West Slope cutthroat trout, and Arctic grayling. We work on West Slope cutthroat trout and Arctic grayling in the upper Gallatin and Madison drainages, and Yellowstone cutthroat trout. Our focus is on the northeastern region of the park and the Lamar River watershed. Again, here, similar threats are non-native fish that were introduced long ago, brook trout, brown trout, and rainbow trout, which unfortunately are so closely related to our cutthroat trout, they can interbreed, and produce viable hybrid offspring. And those hybrid offspring can then interbreed and then produce more. And so over time, you can lose your native cutthroat population due to this, the rainbow trout interbreeding that can go on if they're in the same place at the same time, which they are in some places in the park. Essentially, the approach for West Slope and grayling, especially, is we create these headwater refuges in these remote, pristine areas. We have barriers on the downstream ends of these refuge areas to prevent invasion from non-native fish downstream. So these barriers so far have been like a log construction shown here on Specimen Creek, a really heavy concrete structure on Slough Creek in the canyon above the campground. So it protects the three upper meadows of the Slough Creek system from rainbow trout invasion, this barrier here. Upper Soda Butte Creek, just blasting and shaping an existing waterfall, or Grayling Creek, where we actually used some concrete and shaped an existing waterfall and created a splash pad, is shown here to prevent fish from jumping that would be coming out of Hempigan Reservoir and moving up into Upper Grayling Creek. So we stopped that with this. And even just natural falls like on the Upper Gibbon River, where Little Gibbon Falls is a barrier we can use to maintain native fish above it. So we use a variety of things. And once we have these refuge areas to restore native West Slope and Grayling, we use a chemical, it's called rotenone, to treat these waters and remove any non-native or hybridized fish that might be there. It's the only way we have to completely remove non-native fish from these waters, and that's why we use this chemical. It's an EPA-approved chemical. We've been using it for a couple decades now or more, and we've had great success with this, with very little problems related to it affecting other species or anything like that. But the cool thing about this work is bringing back the native West Slope and Grayling, and it's really exciting to be able to bring in fish or gametes. Most of our reintroduction work is by bringing in eyed eggs or gametes and introducing them to the streams in these we call them in-stream incubators, but they're basically 5-gallon buckets that have water running through them that you put the eggs in, and then the eggs hatch within the stream and the fry emerge out into the creek. And they're sort of yeah, I mean, that's been very successful, us doing that. But sometimes if we need to get fish back into an area really, really fast, we'll just bring them in as juveniles or adults. And sometimes there are things that go on that make it so we have to do that. An example would be if there are wildlife concerns. For example, if there are loons that nest on the water, which happen in the Upper Gibbon on Wolf Lake, and those loons need fish to be successful in nesting. In that case, once we treated Wolf Lake, we reintroduced West Slope cutthroat trout in sizes that the loons could feed upon. This was in October. So when the loons returned the following spring, as the ice was coming off the lake, there was fish in the lake for them to prey upon. And so there's things like that go on in the park that sometimes we have to use different methods to do the fish reintroduction, and sometimes we have to get them in there really fast. But it works. So we've restored West Slope cutthroat trout to Specimen Creek, East Fork, Grayling Creek, both West Slope and Grayling, and then the Upper Gibbon River that I was just talking about, both West Slope and Grayling. And I want to emphasize the work on the results on the Upper Yellowstone, Upper Gibbon River, where we have two fairly good sized lakes, and that this habitat is, produces pretty big fish already. And this has only been a few years into this recovery process up here, but we've got West Slope cutthroat in Grebe and Wolf Lakes that's exceed 20 inches for sure. And they're beautiful. So what we've done here in this project, there were rainbow trout in the Upper Gibbon River that had been there. They were among the first non-native fish ever brought to Yellowstone Park, 1889. And we removed the rainbow trout from this whole system. And we've now have West Slope, cutthroat, and grayling back in here because this is some of the best, most pristine, high elevation habitat for these native species to persist, going forward in potentially a changing climate and warming water conditions elsewhere outside the park and in lower elevations and so on. So that's why we did this. And these fish are here and they're going to stay here for quite a while. And if you're interested in catching a West Slope cutthroat in Yellowstone Park, these fish are here. These lakes are easy to get to, but if you just right where the Gibbon River crosses the Grand Loop Road between Norris and Canyon, the Virginia Meadows there, there's a picnic area there, And these west slope are in that meadow, maybe not these big ones, but there's really nice west slope in that meadow and grayling that it is totally accessible basically to anyone who wants to catch them right there. Even if you just go below the road culvert where they're stacked up all the time, especially the grayling. So I just wanted to point that out. We're pretty happy with this project. When it comes to Yellowstone cutthroat trout, we've been working really hard to preserve the Yellowstone cutthroat of the entire Lamar River watershed in the northeastern part of the park. This is one of the largest remaining outside of Yellowstone Lake genetically pure populations. And this system, these fish are large river migratory cutthroat trout. So they are using this entire Lamar River system here. Each year they'll make large, long distance spawning migrations in the spring to the upper Lamar to spawn, and then move back downstream in Lamar Valley and so on later in the summer and the fall, where they exist over the winter generally. So we've been going at this in a lot of different ways. These are obviously pretty large tributaries to the Lamar that we've been working on. But the main project that we are going forward to try and get done is on a tributary to Slough Creek, which is called Buffalo Creek. It's a priority for us to preserve the Lamar cutthroat trout. So we and some key graduate students at Montana State University studied the cutthroat trout of the Lamar for several years, tagging them, tracking them, studying the genetics of the fish. These are the results of the genetic work. And the light colors in this map, this light yellow or white color, this represents genetically pure cutthroat that remain through a majority of the upper Lamar in Yellowstone Park. And when you see the orange, or especially the red, these are rainbow trout or rainbow trout hybridized with cutthroat trout, which the source of the rainbow trout to the entire Lamar watershed is the upper Buffalo Creek, just north of the park boundary, and also the reach within the park here itself before it enters Slough Creek. This is where all the rainbow trout genetics essentially are trickling down to Slough Creek and the lower Lamar, and then threatening our cutthroat trout of the entire upper Lamar. And so that's why we have this as such a big priority for us, to remove these rainbow trout of the Buffalo Creek system and then reintroduce native cutthroat trout to it to have it going into the future. So you'll probably be hearing more about that in the time ahead. But we also, in a place where we have non-native fish and native that are in the same place, and we don't want to kind of come in and do any kind of chemical treatment and all that kind of stuff. We do what's called selectively remove the non-native fish from that. So we'll stun fish by electrofishing, as shown here in this raft, net them up and put the native cutthroat back, and then remove the non-native rainbow or hybrid from the river. We also do the same thing by fishing. So we have anglers that can catch fish out there in the Lamar or Slough Creek or whatever. The same thing. If they catch a native fish, obviously it needs to be put back. If they catch a non-native rainbow trout or a hybrid, then we remove it from the creek. And we've been having great success doing that, maintaining our native cutthroat of the Lamar. So the electrofishing and the barrier on Slough Creek and so on have been preserving our native cutthroat and of the Lamar and Slough Creek and so on. Anglers play a big role though, because we've estimated that at least in the accessible areas of the Lamar River, Lamar Valley, Lower Lamar River, and so on, each catchable trout is caught probably about 5 times per year. And so that means if anglers can identify these fish and realize that it's a hybrid or a rainbow, then they can have a big impact on helping us preserve the cutthroat by removing them. That's why we put a lot of emphasis into angling, and we have our regulations that align with our native fish conservation goals here. That's why we're doing that, and it's working. In 2002, we started a program. It's called the Yellowstone Fly Fishing Volunteer Program, A gentleman named Tim Bywater led that program as our coordinator for a long time, and then Bill Voigt from Pennsylvania led it for many, many, many years after that. We lost housing for volunteers, and then COVID and so on hit us, and last year the flood. So we've had probably 3 or 4 years where we haven't had the program up and running, but I need to let everybody know that it's back. And Paul Weimer, who is an avid angler and an author, he lives here in Paradise Valley. He is our volunteer fly fishing coordinator, and he has a schedule filled out for this summer where I believe it's about 48 anglers are coming from across the country to participate from between mid-July to early September. But essentially, this is a sort of a citizen science type program. We basically are having volunteers come in, and Paul will take them to areas where we as biologists need information about the fish population, and he will oversee the data collection of the fish that are brought in by the anglers, or the sample collection, like if we're sampling for genetics and so on, and then and basically, guide the anglers through the duration of their trip. And so we're really excited that this program is back up and running again. And going forward into the coming years, I can put you in touch with Paul. I don't know if I have his email on this program right now or not, but he will be recruiting volunteers for the years ahead after we get through this field season, if you're interested in participating. Okay, so the last couple things I'll talk about here is about our regulations and AIS prevention. Our regulations in 2023 are really unchanged from 2022. I do want to mention, though, that the 2022 regulations came out, and a lot of people didn't know ahead of time that we opened the Yellowstone River for fishing downstream of Yellowstone Lake, downstream of Fishing Bridge, between Yellowstone Lake and Canyon, essentially, except for the Hayden Valley reach, of course. But we opened that on July 1st last year, and we will continue to do that. It'll happen again this year, and it'll happen into the years ahead. The reason is that the previous July 15th closure till July 15th was to protect cutthroat trout, reds in the stream from being trampled and so on. But the spawn timing of the cutthroat in this river system here has shifted by weeks. It's much earlier than it was in the past, and there's no reason anymore to keep the stream closed beyond July 1st. And that's why we were able to open that up, and we'll continue to provide that opportunity a couple more weeks on the rivers. There is pretty cool. But that's why we made that shift, that the reds and the fry, the gametes are all gone. There's nothing there for these anglers to harm after July 1st. We've got a pretty aggressive AIS program, I think I would say, in this park, where you've heard a lot about dealing with lake trout, other non-native fish, these kinds of things. We don't want any more of them here. So, and that's why, and the states around us also are very good at AIS prevention. But these things keep coming at us. And we do have whirling disease around Yellowstone Lake. We do have mud snails in a few areas, but they haven't caused a lot of harm that we know of. But a lot of things keep coming at us, including dry-sided mussels, zebra mussels, and quagga mussels, where now every year we are getting boats in Yellowstone Park that are carrying these mussels. They make it even through the state inspection stations and so on, all the way to Bridge Bay before we check, and there they are. And Montana's doing the same thing, and they're getting many, many of these mussel fowl boats now every year. It's just becoming more and more common. And so origins of boats to Montana, that's what this graphic depicts. They basically come from everywhere, including Alaska, all the Canadian provinces, and some really, really problematic places. For example, Florida, which is essentially aquatic invasive species hot zone of this entire, lower 48 for sure. This is why our prevention program is so important. Every watercraft that comes to this park, it's required that they're inspected. If they're found to be dirty, they may be turned around and sent away. We can try and clean some of these boats as they come in, but we probably can't clean them all. And then the same thing would be just with anglers, even when you're within Yellowstone National Park, you need to be mindful and clean your gear in the creek or lake that you're at before you leave and go to another water body in the park. Just clean it with a brush, get all the mud and debris off your boots and other gear. Do the best job you can. You know, we're not asking you to use chemicals or anything like that, but do that before you move from, for example, the Gibbon River over to the Lamar River or vice versa. That kind of thing. It'd be really important for everybody to do that. One of our inspectors down at Bridge Bay. I'll end just with the snowpack we had this year, which I think we're really excited about, keeping our stream flows up this coming summer. This is one of our office buildings down at Yellowstone Lake. This is probably a picture from about 3 weeks ago, something like that, 3 to 4 at the most. Now it's melted down quite a bit, but I think our streams are going to be pretty well charged this year, and hopefully without any kind of flood event like last year. But ice off on the Yellowstone Lake is predicted here in the next week. The long-term average for ice off is May 21, and it might be a few days beyond that, but actually it's looking like the ice might come off really, really soon, especially if we can get some rain and some wind. The fishing opener on the lake and elsewhere through most parts of the park is on Saturday, May 27th. And so it's coming right up. The projects I presented today are funded through a couple different ways. One is Park Service dollars, including the sales of fishing permits for the park, but also a large amount of money comes in from Yellowstone Forever. That's our fundraising partner for Yellowstone, and they have been raising $1 million a year to help support the projects that I just presented to you today. So a huge driver for the work that you're seeing is actually money that's been donated through Yellowstone Forever. I'll end just with a pic of my crew from last year. And I would love to take any questions you guys have about anything you saw or whatever else.
Thank you, Todd. And
Sure.
thanks everybody for submitting questions throughout the presentation. We have them all. And I just wanted to give a quick little overview if there's anybody on here who is less familiar with the Microsoft Teams platform. So if you want to submit questions and you joined via computer, you can see that along the top. There's a toolbar and you'll see a little icon that looks like a speech bubble. You click on that and that should pull up the chat and you can submit questions that way. If you joined on a phone, that same toolbar should be located probably at the bottom of your screen. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Linda and Todd for some question and answer.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Ashton. All right, we've got quite a few questions for you, Todd. Okay. So thank you so much for asking these questions, and hopefully we can get some answers for you. All right, the first one is, do you sterilize the live lake trout that you tag and return to the lake?
Ooh, so sterilize, is that the word you use, sterilize?
Sterilize.
Sterilize? No, I'd say if that means sterilize in terms of making it so they can't spawn again, I would say no, and there wouldn't, I don't know what other type of sterilization there would be, but no, they're the same fish. It's just a little, maybe an inch long incision that we put in their belly and slide the tag in and then suture it shut. So it's, yeah, that's all we do to them. Yep. Hopefully I answered the question that they were wanting there.
Okay. All right. We'll go on to the next question. I understand that the spawning population in Yellowstone and tributaries above the lake are recovering, but how about the resident non-migratory cutthroat populations in these waters? It seems to me that the lake trout predation would have provided a strong selection pressure for cutthroats that would be year-round residents in the Yellowstone above the lake.
Oh, wow. So I don't know that there's been any shifts in, I don't know, we do have there are some resident cutthroat trout in some tributaries of the upper Yellowstone River, south of Yellowstone Lake. Mountain Creek is one really good example of that. So when we are back there working with cutthroat trout, when they migrate back and they're spawning in Mountain Creek or other streams back there, and we're electrofishing, the fish from Yellowstone Lake are really obvious. It's just like, oh yeah, that's a huge Yellowstone Lake spawning cutthroat trout. Okay. But then we'll pick up these smaller fish that are just obvious, stream residents. So the fish are 6 or 7 years old, but they're only, 8 or 9 inches long or something like that. So I know there's places that we have these resident populations. I don't know of anything that's changed that due to the lake trout in Yellowstone Lake in terms of whether there'd be more. I not that I've heard of, or I don't really know exactly how that might happen. But I will say that as a part of the studies we're doing on cutthroat trout right now, we're going into the upper Yellowstone again this year, and we're looking specifically for these stream resident populations along with our migratory fish from the lake. And we're doing genetics work to understand what we call stock structure of the cutthroat population. So it's like it's sort of the uniqueness of the cutthroat that are spawning in the different tributaries and maybe living some of them year round. And it'll take a few years to get this all understood, but in the genetic stock structure, but that's where we're heading. And so we'll know more in the future about that. But there's no question there's some unique stuff out there, and we just want to document what we have, and that's what we're doing. Yeah.
Oh, okay, thanks for that.
Sure.
All right, next question. At what age do lake trout start laying viable eggs?
Yeah, well, age 5. So it doesn't happen in all of them all at the same time. So there'd be a percentage of the fish that are like age 4 maybe, which would be a small percentage that might spawn. Age 5, there'd be more. Age 6, there'd be more. So it's something like, you see, the older they get, the more of them of that age will probably successfully spawn. So there's not like one age that you can say, yeah, they're spawning. It's more like a gradient that gets more and more as they get older. But when you get to fish, especially age 6 and above, they're all they can produce viable eggs. And it's another thing we are also working hard to understand is, so we've been really hammering the lake trout population now for over 10 years and driven the adult segment down by 90%. But, one things that these populations can do is adapt to what you're doing and overcome by being able to spawn at a younger size or a smaller size or younger age, to overcome the gill netting pressure that you're putting on them. And they can also, like in a normal population, maybe I don't know, 40% or so of the fish, what they call skip spawn. So they don't spawn every year, they spawn like every other year. And the other thing that the fishing that we're doing, the gill netting that can do is shift that, so more of the fish that would be skipping actually spawn every year. And so these are the mechanisms that invasive populations like lake trout and Yellowstone Lake can use to try and beat you when you're trying to suppress them. You know what I mean? But it's fascinating from a scientific perspective, which I love. But then from a management perspective, I've been doing this a while. You can see my hair isn't all in brown much anymore. So there's that.
There's that. You got to keep one step ahead of them.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Let's see. Will you be stocking Yellowstone cutthroat trout in those streams no longer having strong spawning populations?
It's an awesome question. Most I think probably most large-scale native fish recovery programs across the country, there's always be a supplementation or a stocking aspect to that. We've never done that in Yellowstone Lake, and maybe we never will. There, and part of it, the reason we haven't is because we were worried about potential impacts of bringing fish from wherever we bring them from and stock them. Even if we brought them from a spot within the lake and introduced them to one of these streams, we were worried about potential unintended negative impacts on the genetic integrity of the population as a whole. So that's why we've been allowing the cutthroat to return on their own. But you're exactly right in that we have many small streams around Yellowstone Lake where, you know, almost all of them are being used by cutthroat trout. We found that out this last year. We took environmental DNA from over 50 of the cutthroat trout spawning streams around Yellowstone Lake itself, and almost all of them had cutthroat trout DNA within them. They're almost all being used, but not nearly to the extent of the numbers of fish that they were prior to the lake trout invasion. So going forward, if a decade from now it's still the case that small streams like Arnica Creek or others that, you know, there really aren't spawning fish coming in here that bears are feeding on or whatever, there might be a good argument to conduct a study where we try and introduce spawning or, you know, fish to those streams and reestablish spawning populations, but do it in a way that is experimental. And we're examining several streams at one time where we're not doing that to see what kind of success there could be. But that's nothing that we have planned right now. But that's a great question.
Okay, great. Thank you. Right. Next one is, how are anglers told or informed on the importance of reporting tagged Yellowstone cutthroat trout?
So we have it in the regulations. We have signs at the backcountry offices and boat ramps and areas that are fished around the lake and that kind of thing. Those are the main ways. Yeah. Yep. I wish there were more, but those are the main ways. And most
Okay.
people, it's kind of self-evident when you catch one of those fish and the tag clearly says call or text and it has my number on there. you know, yeah. Hopefully most people will figure it out. And I think they have. Yeah.
All right, great, thanks. Are you also seeing an increase in Yellowstone cutthroat trout weights in the Lamar drainage?
We don't have empirical data on that or scientific type information. It's just anecdotal from our angling catches and that kind of stuff. So I can't answer that like conclusively, you know, by any kind of scientific way, other than to say like the photo I showed early on or other photos by our volunteer angling program or others, like, you know, these fish are heavy. They're not hungry, let's put it that way. Very healthy fish out there. So yeah. And with that, I mean, people are on here. I mean, I love getting photos emailed to me or texted or whatever. I love seeing fishing pictures and hearing the, you know, what your concerns might be or what you're happy with. I mean, just know that you can reach out to me at any time and share your concerns or joy, whatever they might be.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
All right, why are you canceling the angler reporting this year?
Oh, wow. You know, it's definitely not a choice by me or anybody in this park at all. You know, sadly, it's a nationwide impact by folks at the sort of Washington level of the Park Service. You know, we had angler report cards that went from, we began angler report cards in, I believe it was 1979. And that data set extended all the way up through about 2 years ago when we started going to online license or fishing permit sales online. And when we went to that, we kind of lost our hard copy permit sales. There's some, but most people are just buying, their fishing permit, on their phone, right? And so we've lost the ability to distribute those cards because of the online license sales. And along with that, when we tried to convert our angler report card to an online system or a system where you could input the information on your phone, that's when we basically lost our rights, or we could not get approved to do that. And I'm not exactly sure when we will. It's just kind of hard to stomach after having 40 years of angler information that we can rely on. We use that extensively as managers to understand what's going on across the park, and right now we've lost it. Yeah. So I appreciate your comment and your concern with that, because we are too.
Yeah, thanks for that. Hopefully we'll get something online sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
All right, next question. What is the park's position on using antimycin? Is that how you spell it?
Oh,
and antimycin instead of rotenone?
We've been using CFT legumine rotenone since 2006, just after it came out, and we conducted several studies on impacts to macroinvertebrates and amphibians and so on, and published all that at that time, and it's been the most successful tool for us. And what happened was antimycin became unavailable. We couldn't get it, and I believe that's still the case. So we couldn't depend on acquiring that type of a pesticide consistently over the years, and I think that's still the case. And so that's why, the main reason why we never really used antimycin. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
Sure.
All right. Has the Buffalo Creek field work started yet?
Only thing on Buffalo Creek would be just the pre-work on stream flow measurements and that kind of thing, trying to and a lot of work done on planning for how the project can be implemented once we are able to eventually do that. But in terms of any kind of treatment work or anything like that, the answer to that is no. It may be something we can implement this year, or it might have to wait till 2024. We're kind of not sure about that yet. Yeah.
Are there any updates on the potential for invasive smallmouth entering the park from the Yellowstone River?
I hope they all got washed all the way back to downstream of Billings by the flood last year. I haven't seen another one since. And so I'm actually serious about that. But they will return. And if they can be caught downstream of the park in Paradise Valley and removed by anglers there prior to them ever getting near Yellowstone, that would be a big benefit for us for sure. Yep. So otherwise, no other updates.
One positive effect of the flood, right?
Yeah.
Washed out the smallmouth. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Is there concern about putting fish in naturally fishless water bodies? And how are amphibians and swans doing in the protected areas, given the stalking and angling?
Yeah. So no, that's a great question. We in Yellowstone, we're not in the business of we're not taking water that doesn't already have fish in it and introducing fish. There are definitely places, though, like I described, the Fish Commission back in the 1800s and early 1900s, they brought non-native fish or other fish into the park, stocked them in places that prior to this establishment of Yellowstone, they were naturally fishless. There's nothing there. So we have a lot of places, and including the Gibbon River, the headwaters of the Gibbon, there weren't fish up there when the park was created, but managers dumped them there. And so now in that place and in other places where that happened, it's sort of it's essentially a climate change adaptation strategy for native fish species in the park. So rather than removing all the fish from a place that was historically fishless and then leaving it fishless for the future, we're removing the non-native fish and then replacing them with natives so those species can be maintained in the future in the face of climate change. We don't have any listed amphibians in the park, or anything that's of concern where we would need to reestablish fishless areas for them. If that were ever to happen for some reason, that would definitely be on the agenda. I mean, that would definitely be one of our priorities for the conservation work we do. But right now, the 4 or 5, I think we have a new one that was just picked up here many years ago. Amphibians that we have, they're all in pretty good shape in terms of their populations and so on. So that's why we're taking the approach that we have. That helps.
Okay, thanks, Todd.
Sure.
All right, we've got a few more questions. Any idea why size and weight of fish have increased? Are they eating dead lake trout? And what about smallmouth bass?
So in Yellowstone Lake, when I talked about the size of the cutthroat and the weights of the cutthroat greatly increasing after the lake trout invaded. So the lake trout invaded, and then they, as you saw, the cutthroat trout declined in terms of their numbers. But what that results in then is likely less competition among the cutthroat that remain in the lake. So there are fewer cutthroat out there, but the ones that remain just do that much better with the resources that are available in the lake. And that results in greater growth rates for those fish that are there, greater weights, and so on. That's probably why. That's the hypothesis we have. It's one of the studies that we're doing right now to help understand. But that's probably the reason why. Lower densities of cutthroat, more resources available for the ones that remain, and then they can grow faster and bigger because of it. Yeah. And hopefully I answered the smallmouth question a minute ago.
Yes, flush them away. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Did you know there are still rainbow trout in Grayling Creek? I caught 3 last summer at mile marker 13.
So there's a spot on Grayling Creek where the barrier is, and it's away from the highway. And and most likely you were downstream of the barrier. At least I certainly hope you were. That mile marker 13, that would make sense. Yeah. So there's a lot of Grayling Creek in Yellowstone National Park that runs near Highway 191. That's actually down below the barrier, below the restoration area. And that's why there's still rainbow trout in those reaches of the stream down there. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, great. I've got 2 more questions for you. We're at about 3:05 right now. So we'll wrap up. If anyone out there has any additional questions, go ahead and put them in the chat as we work to wrap up. So the next question is, there has been online angler reporting systems available for the last 2 years. Are you saying that the site will no longer be used?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, it's unfortunate, but we had to take that down. And it honestly wasn't just Yellowstone. It impacted, I think, most of the parks that had any kind of a system like it, which is unfortunate. It's kind of a nationwide issue that arose. So we'll get it back.
All right, last question. Will the park ever look at the Gardner's Hole area to introduce Yellowstone cutthroat trout?
Wonder which creek, which stream.
Which creek?
Yeah.
Let's see. Dave, do you want to put in the chat which creek?
Or is he talking about above on Swan Flats and the whole upper Gardner?
Not sure, we'll go ahead and give them a couple of minutes. Upper Gardner, Indian Creek.
Yeah, no, phenomenal. It's all brook trout country right now. Includes, I mean, obviously miles and miles and miles of creek, you know, due to the large tributaries to the Gardner above, you know, in the Swan Lake Flats area. I mean, that's draining all this east side of the Gallatins there. So, you know, we don't have plans for that right now. We've had a lot of other sort of, you know, challenges on our plate, unfortunately. But that's a great comment, and appreciate hearing the interest in that. But thanks for the questions.
Okay, great. I think that's it. I am not seeing any more questions. So thank you, Todd. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today to learn more about the Native Fish Conservation Program. So we appreciate your time and your support to the park here.
Yep. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Yep. Bye.